Hey guys, it's Jayden Clark here from Jazz Lesson Videos, and today we'll be diving into the world of dominant chords. These chords appear in literally every standard you can think of. Dominant chords, in my opinion, are some of the hardest chords to make sound good because there are so many different ways in which we can make them sound good. For example, we have options such as the Mixolydian, the altered Lydian dominant, the half-whole diminished, the Phrygian dominant, and the Mixolydian flax 6 scales as options, just to name a few. So what can we do to practice this? Now, of course, there is no point in drilling all of these scales if we don't know what kind of sounds we can highlight over dominant chords. That is why we'll be checking out 7 different melodic phrases over dominant chords and breaking down the different kinds of sounds we can highlight to create different kinds of tension and release. These phrases can be found in the 60 phrases on dominant chords PDF package, and in there you'll also find phrases applying to different dominant chord extensions, diatonic, approach notes and enclosures, and much more. To download this resource along with backing tracks, feel free to click the link below. First up, let's start with a plain old C7 chord, and let's get as deep into the sound of the C Mixolydian scale as we can in this first phrase. So the Mixolydian scale, of course, is the 5th mode of our major scale, and it is the chord scale of a dominant 7 chord. So in other words, that is the chord scale that is going to be matching the dominant 7 chord exactly. So this is what we are going to call our inside sound. It is what highlights the harmony exactly. So in this particular phrase, what we can see are some natural points of tension and release. For example, you can see on beat 1 of the 2nd measure, you have a slightly delayed resolution to the 5th of the C7 chord. And this, I would argue, creates just that little bit of tension. A similar thing happens on beat 1 of the 3rd measure, in which we end up resolving to the 7, we move up to the 9th, then to the 13, or the 6th, to the 5, and I'm considering this cell to be unresolved, so therefore creating further tension. Now this similar thing also happens in the final measure, right, where we land on that 13 and resolve to the 5th. So all of these little bits of tension in this phrase are being created solely by using the most inside of our chord scale options. So even though we are playing completely inside of the harmony, of course we can use these techniques such as delaying resolutions to create a little bit of extra tension. And this is how we can approach playing completely diatonic while making it sound interesting and melodic. Now let's spice some things up a little bit and introduce a little more tension. This next phrase utilizes chromatic approach notes and enclosures to give us a more beboppy sound. So you'll notice that on every single downbeat in this phrase, we have a chord tone. Also notice that the Mixolydian scale is still being utilized in between all this chromaticism. Now the great thing that we get out of a phrase like this is what I like to think of as note placement, meaning because we have chord tones on downbeats, we can actually go ahead and then fill in all the gaps with either chromatic approach notes or enclosures, exactly like this phrase is doing. This enables for the smoothest voice leading. And hopefully we can hear, by using the added tension and release that chromaticism gives us, we can hear that beboppy sound that I mentioned before the phrase played. Speaking of tension, let's ramp things up even further with some melodic cells. This is one of the many methods that we can utilize to stretch the harmony to the limits and get as far outside of the changes as possible. So you can see in this phrase, measure 2, we start to see some of these cells moving chromatically. What you can also see are some chromatic cells. I like to look towards the final measure for this, and you can see how that particular chromatic cell can be manipulated throughout the phrase. You actually see this part of it in the first measure, right, when we start the phrase, and you also see it again right at the beginning of the third phrase, just slight variations, but again, it's all borrowing from that same chromatic cell. Also notice the smooth resolution in the final measure. Of course, it resolves to the root note on beat 1. And of course, there is that delayed resolution from the 6th or the 13th down to the 5th that we saw in previous phrases. You'll be able to find more outside concepts like melodic cells, such as pentatonic shifting and triad pairs, in the 60 Phrases on Dominant Chords PDF package. What you'll also be able to find are phrases on different types of dominant chords with extensions, and that is what we are going to dive into next. Before we play this next phrase, it is important to note that you can substitute any dominant chord extension over any plain dominant 7 chord when you are soloing. That means, even though the next few phrases and sounds will be over specific dominant chord extensions, keep in mind that you can use these over plain dominant 7 chords as well. And of course, these appear literally everywhere in jazz standards. This next phrase is over the C7 flat 9 chord and will utilize the Phrygian dominant scale. The flat 9 is the most common dominant chord extension as it leads smoothly down to the 5th of the 1 chord when it resolves. Now, of course, you may be wondering what exactly is the Phrygian dominant scale. Well, I actually like to think of the Phrygian dominant scale as simply being the 5th mode of the harmonic minor scale. So therefore, if you take the harmonic minor scale, let's take C harmonic minor. If you go ahead and start that exact same scale from G, you get G Phrygian dominant scale. Another way you can think of it is simply being a Mixolydian scale, seeing as we are playing this over dominant chords, a Mixolydian scale with a flat 9 and a flat 6. Again, even though we are using a more exotic scale over this phrase, you can also see that every single downbeat we have a chord tone, so it is still clearly spelling out that dominant chord. One other important thing to know about the Phrygian dominant scale is that it's a one-size-fits-all scale over altered dominant chords. Now, other scales that I believe fit into this category are the half-whole diminished scale, in which we'll look at next, and the altered scale. Now, what I mean by one-size-fits-all is that if you have a dominant chord or a dominant chord with different types of extensions, either one of those 3 scales that I mentioned is going to sound totally fine over all of them. So even though the Phrygian dominant highlights the flat 9 and the flat 6 specifically, you could absolutely go ahead and play this over a sharp 9, sharp 5 chord. Is going to sound totally fine. This next phrase will be over a C7 sharp 9 chord, and we'll utilize the half-whole diminished scale. Now, the sharp 9 over a dominant 7 chord is an interesting one because it leads up and by half step to the major 7 if you're resolving to a 1 major 7 chord, or it simply becomes the minor 7 of a 1 minor 7 chord. Now what you'll find is a C7 sharp 9 is really, really clunky because, of course, the sharp 9, also known as the minor third, is a half step away from that major third. Now, the half-whole diminished scale, of course, is pretty self-explanatory by its name, right? It's called the half-whole diminished scale because it literally moves in half steps and whole steps, right? So to derive the half-whole diminished scale, perhaps you start on C, you're going to go C, up a half step to C sharp, up a whole step to D sharp, up a half step to E, so on and so forth. Of course, like I mentioned previously, this scale is also a one-size-fits-all option for all dominant chords. Now, another reason that this particular scale works well over this particular chord, being the C7 sharp 9, is because the half-whole diminished scale also has both thirds, right? It has the sharp 9, or the minor third, and the major third. So it's highlighting both the chord tone and the chord extension in the scale. Of course, another thing that we're noticing with all of these phrases, we have chord tones on strong beats. Now, this phrase in particular doesn't have a chord tone on every single downbeat, right? You see on beat 1 of measure 3, you have that sharp 11 there. But of course, for the most part, you see a lot of resolution to the root note like you do in the final measure. We resolve to that root, and then we resolve again on beat 3 to the root once again. Continuing on with dominant chords with extensions, now we will check out the C7 altered chord. Generally, we consider an altered chord to be a dominant 7 sharp 9 sharp 5 chord, but the chord players, they may adjust this in any way they see fit. Now, of course, the altered scale, much like the Phrygian dominant, we can actually derive it as a mode of a different scale. In this case, I like to think of the altered scale as being the 7th mode of the melodic minor scale. So, for example, if you take C melodic minor, if you go to the major 7, being B natural, you go ahead and start that exact same scale from the B natural, you get B altered. Another way that we can derive the altered scale is by thinking of it as half whole diminished and the other half whole tone. Now, I mention these two methods of deriving the scale because thinking of the extensions can be a little difficult because we have the flat 9, we have the sharp 9, we have the sharp 11, we have the flat 13, all in this one scale. And of course, one other thing to note, even though I am thinking of a couple of these scales, namely the Phrygian dominant and the altered scale, as modes of a different scale, it is really, really important that we build up a level of fluency that we can think of these scales as their own separate entity. So, in other words, we want to think of them in absence of where they are being derived from. Of course, in this particular phrase that you would have heard, you can see clearly the different tensions and release. Of course, the altered scale being much more tense, but again, we are anchoring that with the occasional chord tone on downbeats. And the final phrase that we will check out will also be over the C7 altered chord. This phrase will include approach notes and enclosures along with the altered scale in order to create even more tension. Of course, we can see, even though we are using plenty of tension in that we are using the altered scale and different approach notes and enclosures, we can also see that we have plenty of chord tones on downbeats, as usual. This is to ensure good voice leading. Straight away in the phrase, of course, you can see those chromatic approach notes leading to the 7 on beat 3 of the first measure before ascending up the altered scale, for example. This is how we can connect lines using two really tense sounds. Of course, even into the final measure, we see an enclosure to what I'd consider to be the flat 5, and then of course from there, we just ascend up the altered scale, and we finally resolve on the root note. By being familiar with the different ways in which we can approach dominant 7 chords and common dominant 7 extensions, we can come up with much more melodic lines when we improvise. With these sounds under our fingers, we can be much more confident in our phrasing and our use of tension and release. Now, like I've been mentioning throughout this video, this is all super important because the dominant chord appears in literally every single standard. It is probably one of, if not the most important chord to be able to play over. To go even deeper into these kinds of phrases and concepts, feel free to click the link below to download the 60 phrases on dominant chords PDF package. Be sure to click the like, subscribe, and the bell button so you always know when we're releasing new content. And of course, do go ahead and let us know if there is anything in particular that you would like us to cover in our next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.